Hello, everyone. Picking up lesson 29, lecture 2. We are continuing with the war books of the Aeneid. And one of the interesting aspects of the second half of the Aeneid, as it is written by Virgil, is that at a certain point, the gods and goddesses who are very much involved in the conflict, there's always a parallel story of what's happening among the gods, at a certain point seem to feel almost overwhelmed. And so in book 10, there is a moment when two groups of fighters are in conflict. On the one hand, of course, there are the Trojans under the leadership of Aeneas, who is now getting close to being allied with a group of Etruscans. And on the other side, there are some Rutulians. And obviously, Juno is still against the Trojans arriving, landing, settling in Italy. Nevertheless, Venus is also pushing for exactly that to happen. So the Venus-Juno conflict sort of keeps playing out. Nevertheless, there is a moment in book 10, around line 100, when Jupiter, the Almighty Father, as he is identified here, essentially throws up his hands and says, it's a whatever. So let's see how that goes. So the Almighty Father, this would be Jupiter, who has supreme power over the universe, began to speak. And while he spoke, the lofty house of the gods fell silent. The earth trembled to her base. The high heaven was silent. Then the zephyrs, the winds, were hushed, and the sea mastered and calmed its waters. Just gives us a sense Jupiter can settle things when he chooses to. And this is what he has to say. So take these words of mine to your hearts and fix them there. Since it is not allowed that the Ausonians should be joined with the Trojans in an agreement, and your dissent can find no end, this is to the two goddesses, Juno and Venus, I shall make no distinction in the fortune which each man will have today, or the hope which each pursues, be he Trojan or Rutulian, whether the camp is blockaded because of the fates of the Italians or sinful error on the part of the Trojans and misleading prophecies they have received. And I do not exempt the Rutulians. Each man's endeavors will bring him his suffering and his success. King Jupiter is impartial to all. The fates will find a way. What stands out to me in this passage is that ultimately the anger of the goddesses, the conflict between Juno and Venus, seems to be paralleled with the conflict among the humans. But it seems that usually the gods would intervene, but it's almost like Jupiter really says, like, you guys fight it out and may the better person win, which is very interesting in terms of its suggestion, something contrary to the nature of the fatedness that we have been sort of also getting along the epic. So again, do the gods really decide how this is all going to go down? Is it all fated? Is it supposed to just unfold? Is Augustus and his victories are given? Maybe not. At any rate, the conflict plays out finally in including 3 men in total, whose name I would like you to take on and remember. The first of those 3 men is Turnus, who is essentially the arch enemy of Aeneas in the final books of the epic. They are fighting for the same woman. They are fighting for the same land. They are fighting for the control of the area around Rome. And at this point, Aeneas has an ally from, again, the Etruscan area. Turnus, at this point, again, enemy of Aeneas, kills this ally, Pallas. And this is what happens after he killed him. And Pallas is a younger fighter whose father, Evander, was the one who was the ally of Aeneas. So let's just see how Turnus behaves. What does victory look like is the question I want you to keep in mind as you read these lines. Standing over him, Turnus said, remember these words of mine, Arcadians, and take them back to Evander. I send Pallas back to him as he has deserved to receive him. Whatever honor there is in a tomb, whatever comfort lies in the act of burial, I freely grant him. His hospitality to Aeneas will cost him dear, right? Losing a son, that's terrible. And after saying these words, he pressed his left foot down on the lifeless body, snatching the huge weight of the sword belt and a tale of sin engraved on it. A band of young men, foully slain on a single wedding night at their Bloody Mary chambers, which Clonus, son of Eurotus, had embossed in abundant gold. Now Turnus exulted in this spoil and took joy in the winning of it. So essentially, what the key word here is this sword belt that Turnus essentially grabs from the dead body of Pallas and takes for himself, right? He's exulting in his spoil. He's putting his foot on the lifeless body, and he's very happy that he took this prize from his enemy. And this is the commentary we get from Virgil, line 500. O minds of men, so ignorant of fate and the destiny to come, and of how to keep within bounds when uplifted by good fortune. A time will come for Turnus when he would pay a great price not to have touched Pallas, when he would hate these spoils and this day. So the idea here is that humans have limited access to knowing what is fated, right? It's ultimately questioning the sort of the grand narrative that we Romans know that we are fated to rule the world, right? Do we really? And is there a moment when maybe we are ignorant of fate and destiny to come, and we are ignorant of how to keep it in bounds? The point about this is sort of in any military conflict, when you don't respect your enemy, when you're just like, I beat them, these are bad people, no respect for them, it's usually a moment when the killing just changes its tone. It becomes sort of this super violent and ultimately very damaging kind of conflict for both the winners and the losers. Anyways, this is how the killing of Pallas goes. And so Turnus at this point only has one sort of main conflict to fight out, and that will be Aeneas. And I think there is a bit of a story moment here because at some point, by an arrow that is unclear who it was shot by, Aeneas is wounded in the final book of the Aeneid. And, I guess it's sort of the, this would make a great movie, right? Like, we are not sure, is this really going to work out the way we expected? And anyways, when he is wounded, Aeneas clasps his son, Ascanius, as it is also shown in this beautiful Pompeii wall painting, in a mailed embrace, and lightly kissing him through his helmet, said, "From me, my boy, learn courage and true endurance of hardship, but learn fortune from others." Wow, those are heavy words, right? So be a good fighter like I was, right? And, endure hardship, but I don't feel like I have been very lucky. Like, fortune, not on my side, doesn't feel that way. And he continues, "Now my right hand will defend you in war and will lead you amid great rewards. You must make sure when later your years have matured to manhood that you remember, and as your mind looks back on the example set by your kinsmen, may your father Aeneas and your uncle Hector rouse your spirit." So it's more just wanting to behave in a way that future generations can be proud of you. But Aeneas doesn't seem so happy. This is not like the big happy ending with the loud music we were hoping for. And then there is even more to come. Finally, Aeneas and Turnus encounter each other in a one-on-one conflict. And at a certain point, this is book 12, so we know things are coming to a close. And Turnus realizes at a certain point that the gods have made a decision against him. And this is a point when Juno gives up her rage, or at least allows Aeneas to arrive and settle in Italy. So as Turnus faltered, Aeneas brandished his fateful spear, saw a favorable chance, and with all his force he flung it from afar. Never do rocks hurled by a siege engine roar so loudly against city walls, nor do such crashing sounds burst from thunderbolts. Like a black whirlpool, the spear flew, bearing terrible destruction, and it pierced the edge of his breastplate and the outside of the circles of his 7-layered shield. When, with a hiss, it went through the middle of his thigh. At this blow, huge Turnus fell to the ground, his knee buckling, he's wounded. Right? The Rutulians started up with a groan, his people who are watching this conflict. The whole mountain boomed back around them, and the high woods re-echoed the sound far and wide. He lifted his eyes, this is Turnus, and stretched out his right hand, begging in humble supplication, right? He's begging Aeneas. I have earned it, and I do not ask for mercy, he said. Make use of your fortune. If any concern for a wretched parent can touch your heart at all, I beg you, for you too had such a parent in your father, Anchises, pity Donus in his old age, and give me, or if you choose, my lifeless body to my people. You have conquered, and the Ausonians have seen me stretch out my hands to my conqueror. Lavinia, this is the woman, is yours to marry. Do not push your hatred further. So this is a very interesting way for Virgil to allow Turnus a voice. And in many ways, this is a voice of reason. You have won, Aeneas. This is yours. You get the girl, you get the role, and all my people have seen me begging you. So, and I'm wounded. Ancient world, healing won't work so well. So, I'm never going to be a full person. I'm never going to be a ruler. I'm never going to marry Lavinia. And it sort of sets up a very interesting moral dilemma for Aeneas, whether he should kill Turnus or not, right? That is the question. And then this is how book 12 ends. Aeneas stood there, fears in his arms, shifting his gaze, and he restrained his hand, so he holds back for a moment. And as he paused, Turnus' speech had begun to affect him more and more when the ill-omened sword belt, remember the small sword belt? High on his shoulder caught his eye, shining with its familiar studs, the sword belt of the boy Pallas, whom Turnus had wounded and laid low in defeat. And now he was wearing his enemy's insignia on his shoulders, right? So he recognizes that Turnus had killed Pallas and Turnus had taken the sword belt, right? So Turnus had been cruel in battle before. After Aeneas had gazed at those spoils, which brought back his cruel grief to his mind, on fire with frenzy and terrible in his wrath, he shouted, "You're wearing the spoils of one of my own. Are you to be snatched away from me? It is Pallas, Pallas who sacrifices you with the stroke and exacts the penalty in your guilty blood." Saying this, he buried his sword in the breast of his enemy, boiling with rage. But Turnus' limbs were loosened in the chill of death, and with a groan his life fled complaining to the underworld. So this is the end. Cathartic, maybe a grand killing, but a huge moral dilemma. And the description of Aeneas in this passage, if you find the adjectives that describe him, he's on fire with frenzy and he is wrathful. He is not in any kind of peace of mind. He is not the kind of leader we might want to have as one of our ancestors. So the anger that has driven Aeneas all through the Mediterranean, Juno's rage, now is sort of manifesting in him, and he is an angry warrior. And I think one of the ways to think about this, and this is why we are talking about this in extreme detail, if you wish, other than I think you should all be exposed to the Aeneid in either case, is because it calls our attention to something very critical about what life might have been like in Augustan Rome and some of the things that may have been worked through by Virgil in writing this. And the author that I'm interested in evoking here is the scholar Marilyn Skinner, who wrote a book called Trojan Trauma in the Aeneid. And she takes up something another scholar, Quinn, said, that the first half of the Aeneid, the Odyssean half, you remember, this is how he described, as victims of traumatic loss, the Trojans engage in obsessive attempts to recreate their fallen city. And in fact, they, like how Aeneas himself even considered settling in Carthage. And the second half of the Aeneid is usually taken, along with this other scholar, Quint, as a resolution of this traumatic experience by arrival to Italy, victory, and settlement there. And of course, that all sounds great. But what Marilyn Skinner suggests is that the second half of the Aeneid, the war books, right, that in fact what the trauma leads to is the destructive workings of a certain kind of madness. And you could think here, I mean, the Latin word is furor, so you can think of fury, and you can also think of sort of the rage of soldiers. And what matters to me about this is that you understand that all the civil wars that we have been watching, all this fighting, there is no way that people were not majorly influenced by this. And the question is, how do we settle? How do we pacify a Rome that has suffered so much? And that's the question that we're going to return to in the final lecture of lesson 29.